Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to discuss at the beginning of the show Kashmir, of course, and concerns about women within occupied Kashmir, because that concern has come up very specifically and very directly through the rhetoric of BJP party members, even BJP officials in India, ever since the revocation of Article 370, and of course the global concern that had been expressed by many around the world about the revocation of that article and the effect it would have on the occupied peoples there in Kashmir. Speaking about women in very derogatory terms in many ways, even having some speaking directly about marrying white-skinned Kashmiri women, etc., things which would be unimaginable in any democratic society anywhere in the world and are certainly unacceptable, and also, of course, raise great concerns about the women within that region. To discuss that further, we're now joined by Dr. Inshah Malik, who is a political theorist and gender studies scholar. She's an author as well of Muslim Women, Agency and Resistance Politics, The Case of Kashmir. She's currently joining us now by Skype from Kabul. Inshah, as always, thank you for joining us here in Scope. Inshah, what are your thoughts about the entire rhetoric really around Kashmiri women specifically? This endangers them, doesn't it?
Well, indeed it does, and it kind of speaks about the historical way of, exotifying Kashmiri women, which is a kind of common cultural understanding of Kashmiri women being exceptional in the terms that they are exceptionally victims, or they don't have necessarily the agency to defend themselves. And so, and the other whole rhetoric of the war against Kashmiris is also to dehumanize them and shame them by discussing women. We've seen this happen in many colonial occupations where necessarily the government sort of think of themselves as defenders or saviors of women. But here, what we are seeing is a level further of not just having a claim to saving Kashmiri women, but also using derogatory and more vile language about describing them and having them or taking them. So it's definitely very, very unfair and very, I think, really rejected by Kashmiri women on the ground in terms of how they see themselves being represented in such narratives.
Inshah, there's one discussion, of course, as you clearly pointed out, about the objectification of Kashmiri women. And there's the other issues, of course, which I imagine we can talk about, such as the issue of half-widows within Kashmiris as well. And again, obviously, all that going back to the policies of India. What can you tell us about that?
Definitely women have borne the brunt of the violence for a long time now, about 60 years, because especially in the societies like Kashmir, where gender norms are pretty medieval in nature, women are thought to be dependent on women for their livelihood and for their economic sustenance. And this is what we have seen since 1989, that men in large numbers have left or either being disappeared or being killed in the custody of the Indian forces, which has led women behind without any economic support, and they come out and organize and protest against such practices of violence. But at the same time, I should say that what their coming together has shown repeatedly is their agency and their will to fight against the discriminatory practices in the occupation of their place. So I don't think we cannot keep falling back on the binary of victim and agency, because Kashmiri women, while they are being subjected to the most brutalizing circumstances and most horrible indignations, they still continue to stand up for themselves and fight. So Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons is one such organization that organizes women who have been fighting a legal battle against the Indian state for the last 20 years, seeking, where their men have gone and what are the whereabouts of their loved ones. So I think that shows, that also kind of brings out to the world that Kashmiri women are historically, resilient women, and they have always fought back.
Indeed. And just want to get a final comment before letting you go, Inshah. The Modi government has said that scrapping of Article 370 would actually lead to gender equality and the emancipation of women in occupied Kashmir. Do you at any level agree with that?
So in the state laws, we did have some of the practices that would be seen as they discriminate women, because if Kashmiri women would marry outside of Kashmir, they will not automatically be able to transfer their property to their children or to their husbands who have been from outside. But the point is, it's only the half truth, because a lot of court cases that have happened ever since have actually allowed women to keep their properties, and there are certain safeguards and measures that were in place to allow them to continue having access to their resources and land. But the other point also that we kind of miss out is that where else does this not happen? It's what is seen as an exceptionally Kashmiri Muslim women problem. But this is not only true of Kashmir. There are many other states where you cannot buy land, and you cannot, women have similar kind of restrictions about how they transfer their properties. Yeah. So here, the BJP government and the right-wing forces are using the narrative of women, not for the emancipation of women, but to actually veil this land grab in a way that it seems like, it's for the women, which it absolutely is not.
Okay, Inshah, we'll leave it there at that. But of course, as always, we appreciate your Inshah there speaking to us from Kabul. Certainly very disturbing comments have come out online and in many official statements as well, made by officials, I should say, pardon me, of the BJP party and those who support the party and its ideologies about Kashmiri women specifically. I mentioned the issue of half widows. That's a huge issue for women there in that region. And of course, now added to that is the objectification of all those women as being beautiful white-skinned women, which men around India should be vying to marry now that Article 370 has been revoked. Really derogatory language, and of course one that raises great concerns about the safety and security of those women in that region. Something which we'll keep a very close eye on here in Scope. I'll be back though after this short break. Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, while the U.S. hasn't violated the INF Treaty through its recent test of a Tomahawk missile, which tested successfully into the ocean off the coast of Southern California, that the U.S. is now doing exactly what Russia had feared it would do vis-a-vis a Tomahawk missile is of concern to, specifically, of course, Russia, and should be of concern to the greater world as well. President Putin of Russia saying that the Americans tested this missile too quickly. I'm quoting him directly, way too quickly, after having announced that they are leaving the agreement. He also said that given that Russia has all the reasons to believe that the development to make this ground-launched missile started long before the U.S. walked away from the INF, and that obviously Russia would now need to respond in kind. Let's discuss what this means a bit further, because, of course, the INF Treaty has been of concern to many around the world. Our guests joining us to discuss this further are Katsiaryna Shmatsina, who is an analyst at the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies. She's joining us now from Minsk in Belarus. We're also joined by Emanuel Pietrobon, who writes for Inside Over, the Foreign Affairs section of Il Giornale. He's a political analyst, and he's joining us now from Turin in Italy. And joining us from the Gold Coast in Australia is Dr. Andreas Berg, who is a Russian studies expert. He's also a historian and academic. Andreas, Emanuel, and Kat, thank you all three for joining us. Kat, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Is Russia correct to say that the U.S. probably had made preparations for such a test way before walking away from the INF?
I think that the whole conversation about the U.S. being hypocritical sort of when testing those missiles or violating the INF Treaty or withdrawing from INF Treaty is a rhetoric of a broader issue, which is a great power rivalry, which we observe between U.S., China, and Russia. And to be fair, the INF Treaty was kind of inconvenient for all sides in terms of, arms race restrictions on one hand, and then at the same time, the U.S. and Russia had certain disagreements and the escalation in their relations, but at the same time, there were other sides like China also increasing military capabilities, and China is not a member of INF Treaty, and therefore their capabilities were not limited by this treaty. So what I mean by that is that the INF treaty was sort of obsolete at the time the U.S. withdrew from the treaty, but the U.S. got the major portion of criticism from withdrawing because it did it first. But at the same time, Russia was violating those agreements, and U.S. was sort of violating the INF agreements because that's just this treaty did not respond to the realities of the contemporary international relations.
Emanuel, do you agree with that? Because, narrative that I've heard at least is the opposite of what Kat said, that in fact Russia is being the one that's being blamed, at least in the mainstream media, about violating the INF. Do you think that genuinely both sides did violate the INF and that this may just actually be a good thing, that there needs to be now a new treaty including more countries?
Yes, I completely agree with the previous analyst because the agreement was inconvenient for both parts. And in fact, the first person to speak about the need of review the agreement was not Trump and wasn't Obama, but it was Vladimir Putin during the Munich Security Conference in 2007. And Putin underlined the importance of signing a new agreement, including new rising powers such as China. And in fact, I think in Russia they are happy with Trump's decision because in a way Trump realized Putin's dream.
But then I imagine, Manuel, they're not happy. A test firing of a Tomahawk missile. I mean, Russia has been concerned about that for so long, hasn't it?
Yes. The concern is serious, it is real. But Russia was ready since a long time to start a new arms race, and the United States too. And in fact, since a few days later, the declaration of Trump about the withdrawal from the INF treaty, the United States declared that a new season of the production of new intermediate range missiles was ready to start.
Okay, so Andreas, what are your thoughts about new arms race? Certainly this isn't a good thing in any definition.
Yes, I generally agree with what was said previously, but I think what must be borne in mind is that the original starting positions, that is of Russia and the United States, are grossly unequal. And what I mean by this is Russia has been consistently investing in its cruise missile capability in the way that America has not. And so from that perspective, I think the annulment of the treaty is very much in Russia's long-term strategic interests. Namely, firstly, there was deep resentment over that treaty from 1987 onwards, and concern with its broader ramifications. But most importantly, of course, Russia is a continental power. And so it needs, or it perceives itself to need these kinds of weapons in the way that the United States may not.
Well, Andreas, if we're fair to Russia, though, I mean, Russia says that its concerns are, as you well know, NATO expansionism close to its borders, and as Putin there put it, this Tomahawk missile test is essentially proving and confirming Russian concerns.
Yes, it does. But again, there's a difference in that there's no certainty that a land-based Tomahawk missile will go into full-scale production, whereas, as it were, the Russian variant of that most likely will, if not already in production. In fact, as some analysts suggest, all Russia needs to do is tweak existing Iskander missiles without necessarily modifying launch vehicles, and it will already have a certain strategic initiative which otherwise it wouldn't. So ultimately, the biggest loser out of this is Europe, because the INF Treaty was arguably the second most important treaty Europe has ever had, together with conventional forces. So they'll be the biggest losers, I think.
Okay, so Kat, I imagine all of us are the biggest losers here, aren't we? Because if these two world superpowers enter into a proper arms race, or they may very well already be in an arms race, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that too. But that certainly is not a good thing for any of us, is it? Be it Europe, be it Asia, be it anybody really, or be it you sitting there in Belarus either. I mean, I imagine this endangers all of us, doesn't it?
Exactly. That's a great way to put things in perspective of how this new arms race affects the rest of the world. And yes, there are now, sort of speculations and expectations whether the U.S. will put new missiles, whether they will be deployed to Europe, and if yes, then where, and then how the NATO members would react to that, whether all the EU members would agree on that, and Europe becomes a potential target for Russian missiles in that case. But things get even more complicated for smaller actors like Belarus, which is not part of NATO and is a strategic close ally of Russia, but not maybe to its own will, but to the extent it's dependent on Russia politically, economically, and militarily. And then, Belarus, it's in her strategic interest to stay neutral as much as possible in this whole let's say, turmoil. But at the same time, when Russia sees a threat along its border on the west, and if they see that NATO is increasing military presence along the border, then they might be tempted to place more bases, let's say, or to increase their military presence and try to put some military bases in Belarus, which Belarus certainly does not want. So the bottom line is that this new arms race reality puts a lot of concern into the states, into the security of states that are sort of squeezed in between those major powers.
And do you think we're too optimistic if we say that the INF treaty will be replaced at some point in time with a more all-encompassing treaty that would include other countries? I mean, I imagine, ever agreeing upon such a treaty is always a very tough job, isn't it?
So I think that the hard question is how the powers, the major powers, how the countries can actually agree on such major treaty, because at the eve of the events when the INF dissolution was discussed and the potential threats were discussed, there were ideas to suggest China to join the INF treaty or some sort of a new framework on that, and then China gladly refused because it's not in Chinese interest to limit or regulate their capabilities. And then the question is, so basically how the major powers could negotiate that and how they could agree on something of that major strategic interest.
Emanuel, I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because one of the things that strikes me is that obviously, as you well know, U.S. interests around the world, or just Western interests, if we group it, versus Russian/Chinese interests around the world are quite often polar opposites. I mean, we can talk about Venezuela, we can talk about Syria, we can talk about many, many spheres around the world where these two sets or these two groups disagree quite strongly on certain positions. Can these two groups then come together somehow to even agree upon a treaty to replace the INF?
Well, as the previous analyst said, it is not in China's interest to sign a new agreement limiting its military capabilities. And as we can see, for instance, by the trade war, China doesn't seem willing to stay under American orders. It is a new agreement. It is likely to happen, in my opinion, but not now.
Okay.
But for what regards Russia, it is in Russia's interest to sign a new agreement, including China, because China today is a partner, but tomorrow China could be a rival. This partnership, this strategic partnership with China is only temporary. And as I said before, it was Putin, the first person to say that there is the need to sign a new agreement, including China, not the United States.
Okay. So then what is the European view on this, Emanuel? You're sitting in Italy. So is this a topic of conversation there in Italy and elsewhere within Europe, do you think, at this point? What does Europe want to happen?
Well, about my country, Italy, unfortunately, we don't have a foreign policy. So there is no kind of discussion about the INF treaty. But for what regards Europe as a whole, there is a lot of discussion, especially between France and Germany. And after the US declared the decision to withdraw from the treaty, France and Germany started talking about a project of developing an European army, parallel but complementary to the NATO army.
Yeah.
And also, we shouldn't forget that France has nuclear weapons.
Yeah, indeed. Andreas, I want your thoughts there sitting in Australia. How is Australia reacting to this, if at all? Because it's interesting, isn't it, that again, obviously this affects all of us around the world. And as Emanuel there put it, we know France has nuclear weapons, and in fact, there's some U.S. nuclear weapons placed in Germany as well, which may very well at some point be moved to Poland also. What are people in Australia saying? What is the Australian government saying, if anything, on this?
Well, generally not much. But of course, if there is going to be any kind of agreement between all parties, which would include China, then of course Australia has tremendous interest in that, given Chinese naval expansion in the Pacific. But other than that, what is happening in Europe is not really at the forefront of Australian strategic thinking as of yet. But generally, I think it would be too optimistic to think that an agreement is possible. I don't really see how it's possible for all parties to agree without a prior and perhaps a larger agreement governing anti-ballistic missile forces, because that is really the sting in the situation, in regards to which Russia has grave concerns. Yeah. And without limiting that, I think there can't really be an agreement. And of course, as the other analysts discuss China, and I agree with what has been said, but I think, again, it's almost impossible to agree on that, because it's not in China's interest, but also there's very little experience on the part of Chinese in regards to such agreements. Now, as much as Russia and America may not like each other, but they have decades of experience of agreements, of shared protocols, verification, and the like, which China simply doesn't. So an agreement may be a long, long way into the future.
But then, Andreas, one of the interesting things we're bringing up China and Russia is that the narrative is always that it's the two of them which are the troublemakers, right? Many times in the mainstream media, that's how they're spoken of. Do you think it's as clear-cut as that? Because I imagine that the two of them could then turn around and say, listen, it's actually U.S. military adventures around the world which is creating so much instability and then creating insecurity for many countries around the world.
Absolutely. Some of the concerns voiced by Russian leadership are quite legitimate. One is obviously their great dislike of America's unilateral annulment of the agreement governing anti-ballistic missile capabilities. And the other one is there's a genuine concern that long-range drones can effectively function as types of cruise missiles, and that's a genuine concern. That was not foreseen by the original INF treaty when that type of technology was in its infancy. And coupled with that expansion of NATO to the east, making Russia somewhat fearful, given that it simply does not have the military capability of what the Soviet Union has had.
Indeed.
So any geopolitical change threatens it in a very existential sense.
Okay.
I do agree with you that to a certain extent there's been a demonizing narrative at work. And what
Indeed.
needs to happen is legitimate security interests of all parties should be laid on the table and discussed openly and in a fair and equitable manner.
And I find that's a good point to conclude on. But of course, I appreciate all three of our guests' time. That was Kat speaking to us from Minsk, Emanuel from Turin in Italy, and Andreas was speaking to us there from Gold Coast in Australia. As Andreas there ended off, viewers, it's important that this conversation not take place with demonization of any parties, even those who are not a party of the INF treaty. There's a lot of talk about China possibly coming in on any treaty in the future, but that would all need to be done on an equitable basis, not with the mainstream media just going after these countries as against U.S. interests and threatening U.S. interests and threatening international security and all of the above. There needs to be talk in an equitable and clear fashion about the fact that it is U.S. military adventurism many times around the world which has created insecurity that the Russians and the Chinese then react to in trying to secure their respective homelands. But certainly an arms race, any new arms race, is not in the interest of anybody around the world, really. And we'll have to, of course, keep a very close eye on this because this does, whether we like it or not, it does affect all of us around the world. We'll keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, the U.S. State Department has released what Mike Pompeo has called the countdown to terror clock tracking time until the arms embargo on Iran and the travel ban on the Quds Force commander, Qasem Soleimani, will expire next year. This was something that was agreed upon in the nuclear deal, the 5-year mark, i.e. 2020, since the 2015 nuclear deal would have been signed, that the arms embargo on Iran would be lifted. I believe that will be done in steps, with another step in 2023, if I'm not mistaken. Now, all of this, of course, the United States is using as an excuse to go after Iran, saying that the Iranian quote-unquote regime is the greatest ongoing threat to peace and security in the region. And of course, there would be countries in the region and beyond that would agree with that statement as well. So let's discuss this a bit further, because there are obviously both sides of this argument, which are important to hear about that. Let's now discuss this with Rasha Aljoundy, who is a researcher at Dubai Public Policy Research Center. She's a Gulf policy specialist. She's also visiting fellow at the European Foundation for Democracy. She's joining us now from Dubai. Also joining us now from Beirut is Hussein Abdallah, who is a geopolitical analyst. He specializes in the Middle East, North Africa region, and he's served in different government roles as well. Also joining us from Palmerston North in New Zealand is Sirous Amerian, who is a tutor and guest lecturer at the Center for Defense and Security Studies at Massey University in New Zealand. Sirous, Hussein, and Rasha, thank you to all three of you for joining us. Rasha, what do you make of Pompeo's quite fatalistic, quite alarming tweets about Iran, saying that, when this arms embargo is lifted, that Iran will be free to unleash its terror campaign? Do you agree with that sort of statement?
Thank you, first, Waqar, for having me. In fact, on this, I believe the U.S. administration is very sincere in this warning, allowing Iran to sell its weapon to its proxies and spread more vicious activity through its allies is very difficult through this period, because this will change the equation in the region. Now the equation is related about the amount of confrontation that everybody is ready to go through. Nobody wants war, nobody wants military confrontation. But if Iran is allowed to, for example, buy more advanced weapons from Russia and China, and to sell its weapon for its proxies and allies, this would lead to unintended circumstances. And I believe, like Pompeo, this is what most frightened the U.S. administration.
But Rasha, I imagine if I just side with the Iranians for just a moment, they would say, as you well understand, Rasha, that they have a right to self-defense too, that they have a right to access and buy weapons that they feel would secure the homeland. What's wrong with that?
There is nothing wrong with that, except that Iran is testing ballistic missiles, which is not a defense mechanism. I don't think anybody would say Iran is not allowed to defend itself, but with its policy right now in the region, with the drones that is brought from Iran to the Houthis, that threatens the security in Saudi Arabia. I don't think that Iran can say that its aim is self-defense.
Okay. Hussein, what are your thoughts? Because, again, as I said, Pompeo has quite strongly tweeted about this. And again, the U.S. State Department statement is also quite strongly worded about this issue. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think the best thing to do is to take a step back to understand what the U.S. is trying to do. And I think the key problem that the U.S.'s regional allies had in the Middle East after the signing of the nuclear deal was that even without the nuclear deal, they were having a really hard time to try to contain Iran in the region. And they thought that Iran was doing pretty well. Even under sanctions, they were still able to score on the regional front through supporting many allies and different proxy groups. So what they thought is that as a result of the nuclear deal, Iran is going to get a lot more resources that they will be able to invest in even further bolstering the regional position. So what the U.S. is trying to do now with the Trump administration is basically to reverse the two sequences of the nuclear deal. So to make it harder for Iran to be able to maintain its foreign policy, because the problem that the U.S. and its allies have with Iran is particularly about its foreign policy. Now, whether Iran has the right to purchase weapons or not, yes, of course, if you put yourself in Iran's position, then as a sovereign state, they do have all the right to do so. And they still sort of honored their part of the nuclear deal. They did not violate the JCPOA. So,
but then, Hussein, as Russia, they're pointed, of course, the ballistic tests have not helped Iran's cause, have they?
Yeah, I mean, the ballistic missile issue is always going to be a problem. Iran has articulated many times that in the end this is for self-defense. But like Russia pointed out, the fact that Iran has transported that sort of missile technology and drone technology to other parts of the region to engage in other sort of proxy conflict is alarming for the U.S. and its regional allies.
Okay, Sirous, what are your thoughts on this? Because, again, there are two sides to this, but I imagine that having the U.S. Have this much influence, and obviously it does, being a part of the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member and having that veto power. But again, it's not a party right now to the nuclear deal because it chose to walk away from it itself. What are your thoughts about this deadline, as it's put, this countdown to terror that is coming in 2020?
Yeah, well, I think this is a handmade conflict that the U.S. ignited themselves in the Middle East with Iran. This conflict did not exist a couple of years, when before President Trump came into the White House. So whenever this fire kind of tries to die down, you have Mike Pompeo, Bolton, or Trump coming in and kind of breathing fresh air into this fire so that it goes up. And, this countdown to terror and the canceling of the sanctions, of arms sanctions, just seem to be one of those, games that the Americans are playing to kind of keep this fire going. Because essentially Iran has been able to buy SAM systems, has been able to buy radar facilities from China, from Russia in the past. And even if those sanctions are lifted, Iran does not have a lot of cash lying around to go on a shopping spree like Saudi Arabia, which is currently like the third or fourth biggest spender of military in the world. So it's not going to be a very drastic change. And even if Iran manages to buy, weaponry, it's not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to send tanks from Tehran to Beirut. You have to go through Iraq and Syria, and it's not going to be easy. If such a thing happens, those weapons will certainly be attacked. So it's not going to be a big game changer. I think this is just an excuse to keep the fire of this conflict going.
And that's a good point, isn't it, Rasha? Because I wonder, on just this point about the fact that U.S. sanctions, now that they have been reinstated, there are, in the U.S.'s eyes at least, there are concerns about whether the Chinese, the Russians, and other allied countries of Iran specifically would even respect them. Because the world has changed, has it not, Rasha, from a very unipolar world to a multipolar world now. Do you think it's even healthy for the U.S. to necessarily have this much power over, be it Iran or be it any other country's arms or defense policies, etc.?
Well, I believe the U.S. is not saying that it will prevent Iran from having any military purchase from Russia and China. It's just it's warning the international community for the 2020 lifting of the ban. It's warning the international community for the security danger from lifting the ban without going through serious negotiation with Iran that the U.S. really want. The maximum pressure policy on Iran aims to push Iran towards negotiating on the issues that Iran doesn't want to tackle, like the ballistic missiles that financing terrorist organization, like its malign activity in the region.
But for a moment, Rasha, and I think we've spoken about this before. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but this just came to me. Do you not think that individual countries in the region, so I'm just going to hone in on the UAE because that's where you are, but recently we had that, actually not too recently, but a few weeks ago, we had that meeting between a UAE, I believe it was a military official and an Iranian military official, and they came to some sort of an agreement or understanding about, security and safety within the Persian Gulf region, the Strait of Hormuz, etc. Do you not think that that is a healthier way for one to go about these sorts of things versus having an external power such as the U.S. having that much influence?
I don't believe that any agreement that could not be reached between the UAE and Iran is done without the U.S. knowing or coordination with the U.S. This is first of all. I don't think that anybody would want to go through violence to secure the region or to prevent Iran from being apart from securing the region. The problem is Iran wants to influence the region directly, like in Iraq or in Syria, through militia and through terrorist organization. I think the UAE knows that the aim is not confronting Iran military. The aim is negotiation, pressuring Iran to negotiate on the issues that Iran doesn't want to tackle, to change the Iran policy from malign activity to a normal, friendly neighbor. And the UAE is really an example for this.
Okay, so Hussein, one thing that Rasha there said, it strikes me because, again, obviously, as you well know, the U.S. has titled its policy towards Iran as one of maximum pressure. And essentially, again, as Rasha there said, seemingly that the goal is to try to get Iran back to the negotiating table to negotiate those things on which the international community, or at least the West in many ways, is concerned about when it comes to Iranian policies in the region. Do you think that that will at any point actually succeed?
Well, I think it's you don't want to play the guessing game. There's a real problem if we go that way. But we do understand what the U.S. is trying to do here. I mean, restricting Iran's ability to export its oil. This is where all the problems started, right? And I think the escalation in May was directly related to the cancellation of the waivers. And we saw, and since you raised the maritime issue, which is, I think, extremely important, because Iran has demonstrated in the past few months, if you want, starting May from the Fujairah attack moving forward, that they do have some sort of capacity, some sort of capability to disrupt the energy sector, right? And this is just the tip of the iceberg. be it the Fujairah attack, be it the attack against the East-West pipeline, be it the attacks against the tankers in the Gulf of Oman. And this is exactly what prompted the UAE to have that sort of attempted de-escalation in order to safeguard its maritime interests.
I mean, I imagine, Hussein, for even somebody like you who's currently sitting in Beirut, I imagine even the Lebanese would want the ratcheting down of tensions in the region, considering Iran has significant influence there too, doesn't it?
Every rational person in the Middle East wants de-escalation. Every person who is actually thinking of the best interest of the region would want a de-escalation and would want to avoid a military confrontation. So that is the same policy. Anything else is actually asking for a regional instability on a really grand scale, right? And we do hope that most of the countries and the parties involved in this crisis would apply that sort of rationality when they look at this issue.
Okay. Sirous, I wanted to get your thoughts because we've covered ground here. What are your thoughts on how, if it's smarter, let me put it this way, for regional countries and others to, on an individual basis or as a group, without even necessarily having the U.S. being directly involved at the very least, coming to an understanding with the Iranians about their regional role, etc.?
I think this goes to the heart of what Rasha was saying. It was very contradictory. We have the United Arab Emirates interfering in Yemen, in Sudan, in Libya, and in Syria. And someone from Dubai says Iran should be a friendly country and not interfere in other nations. I mean, one of the things that the countries of the region should realize is that Iran is an organic power like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, and exists in this nation, in this region. And if you want to avoid conflict, they should all sit down and speak together. And if the UAE sees within its rights to interfere in Yemen, in Sudan, and Libya, it's probably in Iran's right to interfere.
But to be fair, Sirous, if I may just come in for a moment, to be fair, if we're looking at this from both points of view, the other side would definitely say, listen, it's because of Iranian influence, it's because of Iranian what's called proxies in the region, be it in Yemen or elsewhere, that many of these countries, or better yet, to say the U.S. And its allies would get involved. Do you not think that there is a need actually for the Iranians to also take a step forward and say, listen, let's talk, let's not get into this proxy situation?
Exactly. I mean, the problem is that the first time that Iran sat down and talked with others, it actually collapsed, and that was the JCPOA. So Mr. Khamenei was very pessimistic about negotiating with the Americans. They said that they are not to be trusted, but he gave the go-ahead, Iran negotiated, and after a couple of years, the U.S. went back on its word. Had the U.S. stayed in the deal and a couple of more years showed its goodwill towards Iran, then, they could move on to talk about ballistic missiles and, regional proxies. But again, I've never heard of any Iranian proxies in Sudan or in Libya or Egypt. And those are countries that the UAE has gone in and established a military presence, or in Djibouti. So it's not just about Iran, it's the article that, they call the UAE Little Sparta, and these countries want to expand their power, whether Iran is there or whether it's not. But, going back to the point, if the U.S. was serious about negotiating and, talking with Iran over issues, it should have probably gave a couple of more years to the only time that Iran sat down with many other countries over table and talked about an issue. And, they should have probably kept to their side of the deal and then went back to Iran to ask for more. You can't go back on your words and then come back and say, no, you should give us more.
All right, we're going to leave that as a concluding comment. Viewers, you have both sides, of course, of this issue, hopefully there. That was Sirous Amerian speaking to us from New Zealand. We were also joined by Hussein Abdallah, who is speaking to us currently from Lebanon, and Rasha Aljoundy, who is speaking to us from the UAE, Dubai specifically. We thank them all for their time and, of course, their expert insight. Now, as I said, both sides we've spoken about here on this issue. Will the U.S. actually act when it comes to what it's calling the countdown to Terror Day, the lifting of the arms embargo, or at least one step of the lifting of the arms embargo on Iran? This was, of course, decided upon within the nuclear deal that was signed in 2015 between Iran and the P5+1 group of countries, which at that time at least included the U.S., does not now include the U.S. The U.S., remember, is not a party to the nuclear deal anymore and does not, at this point in time at least, have influence around the negotiating table in that regard. The Iranians would say they need to defend themselves. If they need to buy weapons from the Chinese and Russians, they'll need to do so to defend themselves. But again, as Russia, they're put there is concern about Iranian actions within the region. Regional countries and others have major concerns about Iran as well. But again, as I'd put to Russia as well, those talks that Iran and the UAE had, can that be an example of how things may be resolved on an individual basis or regional basis? That's certainly something that I believe should be explored further without necessarily direct U.S. involvement. We'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.